So what we're going to go over now is the design principles that are pretty much the foundation for thinking about two-dimensional design, three-dimensional design. These are all themes that are going to be repeated throughout any artistic career. They're always kind of like that backbone, that foundation. And, in this class, we're going to focus on, how it is functioning in both sculpture and in architecture. So one of the first design principles we're going to talk about is variety. And variety is a way of combining visual elements to achieve intricate and complex relationships. Variety can be expressed in hues, values, lines, textures, and shapes. Now, this is one that we will find happening quite a bit in artwork. You can have a form that's kind of repeated, like in this image right here, but then what's unifying all of it is like color, similar structure, similar shape, but then the way it's being varied would be the position of the windows, the angles of how these cube structures are being assembled in the architecture. Whereas like different examples of this piece right here by Eva Hesse, she's using variety in a way where all the forms are radically different, but yet they're all consistently a similar color. They're all consistently, kind of having this hanging type gesture, or they're hanging or they're suspended on a wall in some way, shape, or form. Another way variety can be achieved is, similar to the first image where things are similar color or shape, but then, something like scale is what's varying this particular piece. You have some of these forms that are really small and then some of these forms that are really big. This is a piece by Andy Goldsworthy. This is a photograph of things that he found in nature and put inside of an empty tree trunk. Next design principle we're going to talk about is rhythm. So rhythm is more or less a regular pattern created by the elements of design as they seem to move and change through time and space. So, again, like it's similar to variety in some ways where there is that singular consistency. So in this case, it's got a singular consistency of the same form being repeated over and over, as well as like the same color, right? It also has like a very unified motion of, this line, essentially, it's like the foundation of the piece, creating a consistency. So rhythm basically focuses on that consistency, okay? So, in this piece, it has movements that are going up and down, flowing and pausing, sudden changes in value, almost like thinking about music, right? So if you think about rhythm, rhythm is as part of, a way you would describe music. It can also work in sculpture. This piece, similar to the first one we looked at, similar consistency, all color, all kind of making like, a singular line. In this piece, you have one guy gesturing to the left, and then the other three have their arms raised to the right. So, it starts off with like a very specific motion, and then it bridges into something that's a radical change from the left arm gesture to the straight up gesture, but then, the importance of that gesture is being repeated because there's three figures. So it's almost showing more emphasis, which is going to be another thing we'll be talking about shortly, in this particular piece. And emphasis here, just to kind of reiterate what I was just saying, is emphasis is a part of a design that catches the viewer's attention. The artist will pick one area or sometimes multiple areas by contrasting it with others. The area could be different in size, color, texture, or shape. So whenever I've had people look at this piece, I usually pose the question, okay, where do you think the emphasis is on this piece? The other term that could be interchanged with the word emphasis can also be focal point. So basically what a focal point is where your eye is drawn to first. And with this piece, I usually get a couple different responses. Most people will say down at the base of the piece where the tower is going into the ground would be the point of emphasis, which makes sense because, a lot of the structure is kind of gesturing downward and pointing toward the ground. The other area people would say there's emphasis is this window up here where there's glowing light. So neither answer is wrong. Both answers are definitely right. The thing about art is there are many different answers to one question. So things aren't necessarily a wrong answer. Things can just have many different views and interpretations. So yes, some people will say the base is the point of emphasis. Some people will say the window is the point of emphasis. And there's multiple ways artists have gone about thinking about emphasis. So in this case here, this Naum Galbo piece, I would argue that this middle piece where there's this giant area of what's called negative space. So negative space is something where there'd be like a void or there wouldn't be something there, but the artist would utilize that. And you see this in two-dimensional art, you see this in this case that we're looking at in three-dimensional art. So, to me, this open area here where the negative space is would be considered the point of emphasis. Now, this is a really famous church in Spain. It is the Church of Sagrada Familia. And this piece here, I would argue, or this piece of architecture rather, I would argue that the point of emphasis would be all of the towers kind of gesturing upward, right? So a fun fact about the history of churches is a lot of times when you look at architecture of churches or like holy places or temples of some sort, a lot of them have structures that are kind of moving upward, right? And the idea was in order to have a structure that was kind of going up high or gesturing toward the sky, it was supposed to be a way to become closer to whatever celestial or holy being you believed in. So, I thought that was really interesting, especially in regards to the point of emphasis. So, anytime you kind of see like something like a tower or, a high up structure, that's kind of the idea behind it is, kind of either like being above or kind of being closer to the sky. Balance. Balance is a really cool design principle because it can be interpreted in several different ways, and artists have gone about it in some really interesting manners. So balance is the distribution of visual weight of objects, colors, texture, and space. If the design was a scale, these elements would be balanced to make a design feel stable. So not only are they referencing it as gravity, but they're also talking about it visually. So balance can happen in several different ways. So we have a couple different examples here. So this is symmetrical balance. So anytime you're talking about something with symmetry usually means that you have something that's like an even form. So if you were theoretically wanting to split it half, it would be two exact copies. So in this case, symmetrical balance. It's the formal placement of identical parts on each side of an imaginary vertical axis. A central line that could be drawn vertically through the piece. So again, like I said, if you cut the piece in half, you would basically have two parts that were exactly the same. That's symmetry. Now, on a different note, we're going to talk about asymmetry, which asymmetry, that means areas on either side of a central vertical axis are not identical, but appear to have the same visual weight. So I'm sure everybody's thinking, wait a minute, what does that mean? Okay, so it doesn't have the symmetry aspect, but it has the same visual weight, right? So we have these pieces right here where they're a little bit more abstract, the shapes aren't the same, okay? So that's what's making it asymmetrical. When we bring in the idea of balance, visually, if you take a look at this piece, there's just about as much visual weight, so about just as much material happening on either sides of the sculpture here, where it feels like, one side isn't as, heavy as the other necessarily, okay? But again, these pieces they're the opposite of symmetrical. They're asymmetrical, so you can't cut them in half and have two pieces like that, right? But because of the way this is built, the piece still has balance to it. Then the next piece we've got here is radial balance, which basically you're having elements arranged around a central point, and they might be similar. So, in this case, like pieces like a mandala, or, here where you have like a center structure and everything's just kind of evenly distributed, that would be radial balance. Proportion and scale, another really important aspect of design. So, thinking about like how you can make some parts bigger and some parts smaller. This also ties into variety really nicely, like we were talking about before. So, you can make certain parts that are larger, and they show kind of more emphasis and importance. And then, you can make smaller parts that maybe are a little bit more textural. There's a lot of different ways you can kind of play around with that. What you'll notice is, as we're talking about these principles, a lot of these can kind of bridge into one another, but things like scale and proportion are really important. So this is a sculpture by Moran Muick. So this is the sculpture and this is an actual person, right? So this is huge. And then you have things like the opposite, where this is just like a really small, tiny piece. Unity is the next one we'll go over, which is the feeling of harmony between all parts of the work of art, which creates a sense of completeness. So that basically means, you're thinking about like every material that you're working with and how it's really kind of coming together and coalescing as one piece. Like in this example here, there's so many components and parts. This is a piece that is a little bit more conceptual or idea based. So this is more of like an altar bed piece. And as you see here, there's all kinds of different imageries of like saints and different kind of reliquary type images that kind of feed into this larger piece. So, unity is a way to kind of accomplish, how do these parts all come together and bridge as one. So again, with this piece, lots of components in order to talk about the idea behind it. And, same with, material and how it all kind of fits and coalesces. So John Bisbee, really great example of sculpture using unity. Unity can also be tied in with the idea of repetition. Okay, so with John Bisbee, we're seeing a lot of repetition, a lot of repeated design. A lot of design that kind of coalesces into one consistent sculpture. So unity is a fantastic example with his work. We have several different ways he uses this nail material here. Next artist is Tara Donovan. Again, a lot of her work uses unity. It's all like really consistently done with different forms, and she is known for using a lot of mundane materials that radically transform into different kinds of landscape-like things or cloud-like things. She uses really accessible, easily definable materials in order to do this. For example, this piece is Dixie cups. And so these are some other examples of ways different artists have approached using like one singular material to kind of create different design-based sculptures off of this. This one was made all with paintbrushes. This one was made all with straws. This one's all made with crayons, matches. So you can really radically transform, these materials that you're using. In our case, we're using Q-tips, but as you'll see with some of our student examples, that it will be in another presentation, you'll see that there are a lot of different answers to that question of, how can I radically transform this material to make some really interesting sculptures based on design. So, you all will be making 4 small sculptures, and you'll have 4 different responses to how you can approach it. So, actually there are a couple student examples in this one, but I will have more in another PowerPoint. This is one example of a student with Q-tips. Here's another. Some people like to paint them, so that way they're kind of standing out from the standard white Q-tip. I've had people make it look kind of like, explosions, or they thought about like, what happens when we bend the Q-tips, or start, taking apart the cotton material in the Q-tips, making curves. So there's a lot of really great ways you can think about different materials and just kind of how, they come together, and I think the most important thing is just taking the time and really playing around, seeing what can be done. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with for the first project.